My sister called me last week crying, asking if I would just talk to our parents. I hung up. That's where we are now. That's what our family has become. And I want to be honest about why, because I think I owe that much to the version of myself that stood in my parents' kitchen 7 years ago. And believed, genuinely believed, that family meant something unconditional. It doesn't. Or maybe it does, and that's the problem. Because my parents loved my brother-in-law unconditionally, and that love cost them everything else. Let me start at the beginning. My sister. I'll call her my sister because that's who she is. The only way I know how to think of her. Married her husband 9 years ago. I was the best man. I gave a toast about loyalty and showing up for the people you love. I cried a little. And I didn't even feel embarrassed about it. I meant every word. Her husband. I'll call him her husband because I refuse to give him the dignity of a name in this story. Was charming in that way that certain men are charming. The kind of charming that works on everyone except the people who have to live next door to it. He had a good job in financial services, made decent money, drove a nice truck, and could walk into any room and leave 20 minutes later. With everyone thinking he was their new best friend. My parents adored him from the first dinner. My father called him the son he never had. Which, for the record, I was standing right there when he said it. I smiled. I always smiled. My sister was happy, or she seemed to be. And I didn't ask too many questions because she was an adult. And I respected her privacy. And also because some part of me didn't want to know if the answers were complicated. We had a good relationship. We talked most Sundays. She'd call me on her drive home from the gym. And we'd catch up on the week. And sometimes she'd say things that gave me pause. He gets like that sometimes. Or we had another, rough one, and I'd wait to see if she wanted to push it further, and she usually didn't, and I didn't push either. That's one of the things I've had to sit with since all of this happened. Whether I could have seen it sooner. Whether I should have. About 4 years into their marriage. My sister and her husband started trying for a baby. It didn't go well. Multiple failed attempts, 2 miscarriages, and a lot of grief that they mostly carried separately. Or so she told me later. She said he got distant during that time. Said he started staying late at work more often. Coming home, smelling like a bar on nights. He'd said he had client dinners. She said. She thought it was just how he processed stress. She gave him the benefit of the doubt. That's what you do when you love someone and you're in the middle of shared grief. You extend grace, even when grace is being abused. The person he was spending his late nights with was a woman from his office. My sister figured it out. Way most people do, not through any dramatic confrontation, not through a private investigator, but through the quiet accumulation of small things that didn't add up. Until the morning she went to use his laptop for a work call. And found a message thread she was never supposed to see. She called me first. She didn't call our parents, she called me. I drove to her house in 45 minutes, which normally takes an hour, and I sat with her at her kitchen table. While she showed me the messages. I'm not going to describe what was in them. It's enough to say that it wasn't a single mistake. It wasn't a thing that had happened once in a week moment. It had been going on for 18 months. My sister was shaking. Not crying, not yet. She was past the part where crying makes sense, into the part where your body just vibrates with the enormity of what you now know. She asked me what she should do. I told her that wasn't my place to say. I told her whatever she decided, I would back her up. I told her I was sorry and I meant it down to my bones. Then I told her she had to tell our parents. She didn't want to. She knew how they felt about him, and she already understood. In that quiet way women often understand things long before they can say them out loud. How that conversation was going to go. But I convinced her. I said they were her family. I said they would show up for her. I believed that. I want to be clear that I genuinely believed that. We drove to our parents' house together that Sunday. I remember my mother was making roast chicken. The whole house smelled like rosemary and garlic, and there was a hockey game on in the other room. And everything looked so ordinary, so stubbornly normal, that I felt a little sick. My sister sat down at the kitchen table, and I sat beside her, and she told them. She told them everything. The messages. The 18 months, the woman from his office. She told them she was filing for divorce. My father turned off the hockey game. My mother stopped moving at the stove, and for about 30 seconds, nobody said anything. Then my mother said, "Has he given you an explanation?" My sister looked at her. "What do you mean, an explanation?" "People make mistakes," my mother said. "Marriages go through hard times. You've been through a lot these last few years, both of you." I felt the floor shift under me, not metaphorically. I actually gripped the edge of the table. My father said, "Before you do anything permanent, maybe the two of you should talk to someone. A counselor. Something." My sister said very quietly, "It was 18 months, Dad." "I know," he said. "I know, sweetheart. But divorce is." He paused. "We just don't want you to make a decision you can't take back, when you're in this much pain." I looked at my sister. Her face had gone very still, the way faces go when a person is deciding whether to fall apart, or hold themselves together. And she chose to hold herself together. And I have never in my life been more simultaneously proud of and heartbroken for another human being, she said. I think I need some air, and she went outside, and I stayed at the table with my parents. I said, what just happened? My mother set down her wooden spoon. She said very carefully, we just think this could be worked through. I said, he cheated on her for a year and a half. He was cheating on her while she was miscarrying his children. My father flinched at that. Good, he should have. But then he said, he's family. 3 words. I've turned them over in my head so many times since that day. Like a stone I can't stop picking up. He's family. The man who'd been sleeping with a colleague, while his wife cried into her pillow, had been elevated, in my parents' accounting, to the status of family, while their own daughter sat on the back step, trying to remember how to breathe. I said, she's your daughter. My mother said, of course she is, we love her. We're not taking sides. You just did, I said, that's exactly what you just did. I went outside and sat with my sister until she was ready to leave. We didn't talk about what our parents had said. There wasn't anything to say about it, not yet. In the weeks that followed, I watched my parents do something I can only describe as a sustained, low-grade betrayal. They didn't throw a party for him. They didn't sit her down and explicitly tell her she was wrong. It was quieter and crueler than that. They took his calls. They met him for lunch. They expressed, repeatedly and always framed as concern for my sister, their hope that cooler heads would prevail. When my sister hired a lawyer, a good one, because he'd been controlling their finances and she needed protection. My mother told her she thought it was escalating things unnecessarily. My sister told me all of this on our Sunday calls, still driving home from the gym, her voice flat in a way that scared me. At Christmas that year, my parents invited him. They didn't tell my sister ahead of time. She showed up at the house with a bottle of wine and a bag of gifts, and he was already there, sitting in the living room with my father watching the Raptors, and she turned around and left, and I left with her. My parents called me that night. My father said they hadn't thought it through. My mother said she felt terrible. I said, then why did you do it? And they didn't have an answer, and I told them I needed some time before I could talk to them again. I took about 3 weeks. Probably should have taken longer. The divorce proceedings took most of the following year. He made it difficult. He'd been managing their joint investments, and it turned out I'll be here because some of it is still legally complicated, managing them in ways that primarily benefited himself. My sister's lawyer caught it. He tried to argue it was poor communication, not misconduct. The judge was not persuaded. In the end, my sister came out okay. But okay. She got the house. She got a settlement that reflected what she was actually owed. He lost his job at the firm a few months after the divorce finalized. I don't know the details. My sister didn't tell me, and I didn't ask. I only know that he lost it, and that afterward he moved back in with our parents. That last part I found out from my mother, who mentioned it in a phone call. Like it was completely normal information. Like she was telling me the neighbor had gotten a new dog. I said, he's living with you? She said, he's going through a hard time. I said, the hard time he's going through is a consequence of choices he made. She said he doesn't have anywhere else to go. I said, Mom, he doesn't have anywhere else to go because he burned every bridge available to him. That is not your problem to fix, she said. He's like a son to us. There it was again. He's like a son to us. My sister's ex-husband, who had cheated on their daughter for 18 months, who had financially manipulated their daughter, who had made her Christmas a nightmare and her divorce a year-long battle. He was like a son to them. And I was their actual son. I was standing in my apartment, in Vancouver holding my phone, and I was their actual son, and somehow that sentence landed on him. I told my mother I needed time to process this. She said she hoped I would understand eventually. I said I wasn't sure I would. We hung up. I called my sister. She already knew. Of course she knew. Word travels in families even when the families aren't talking, and my sister had learned to anticipate every new way our parents would find to make her feel like an afterthought. She said, I'm okay. I said, you shouldn't have to be. She said, I know. For about 8 months I had minimal contact with my parents. Birthday calls. The occasional text. Nothing that required me to be in the same room as the situation I couldn't fix. I was angry, but more than that, I was tired in a way I didn't have language for. The kind of tired that comes not from doing too much, but from caring too much for too long, about people who are not using your care wisely. My sister in the meantime was rebuilding. She started therapy, which she'd resisted for years. She went back to finish the graphic design certificate she'd put on hold during the marriage. She got a cat named something ridiculous that I'm not allowed to make fun of. She had good weeks and bad weeks, and on the bad weeks she called me and I answered. And on the good weeks she called me too and I answered those as well. My parents' situation with her ex-husband deteriorated in ways I only heard about secondhand. He wasn't working consistently. He'd had some kind of falling out with a business partner over a contract dispute that apparently became a lawsuit. He was, from what I could gather, not handling any of it particularly well. And my parents were absorbing the fallout of all of it. Financially, emotionally, logistically, because that is what happens when you decide that a charming man's comfort is worth more than your daughter's dignity. My mother called me last spring. Her voice was different, thinner, somehow like something had been stretched out of it. She said her husband had been hospitalized. Heart attack, serious, he was in the ICU. She said she was scared and she needed the family together. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, I'm sorry he's sick. I hope he recovers. She waited for the rest of it. I said, but I'm not coming. She said he could die. I said, Mom, I'm sorry for what you're going through. I genuinely am. But you made choices over the past few years, and those choices have consequences. And one of those consequences is that I am not in a position to sit in a hospital waiting room beside that man and pretend that any of this is okay. She cried. I let her cry, because I wasn't going to pretend I was made of stone, but I also didn't change my answer. She said, we're your parents. I said, you are. And you're also people who invited my sister's husband to Christmas without warning her. Who told her she was escalating things by getting a lawyer. Who let him move in with you after he financially manipulated her and didn't tell her until I happened to call on the right day. You can be both of those things at once and I can love you and still not come, she said. We didn't think. I know, I said. That's kind of the whole problem. I called my sister after I hung up with my mother. She already knew about the hospitalization. She was quiet on the phone for a long time. I asked her how she was doing with it, and she said something I think about a lot. She said, I don't hate him. I thought I would, but I don't. I just don't have anything left to give him or about him. I used it all up during the divorce. I said, that makes sense. She said, does it make me a bad person that I'm not rushing to his bedside? I said, no, it makes you a person who got hurt very badly and learned where her limits are. He survived. Made it out of the ICU after 10 days, apparently. I know this because my sister told me, not because my parents did. My parents and I have spoken twice since the hospitalization, both times brief, both times ending without resolution. My mother said they'd made mistakes. My father said they never meant to hurt anyone. I said I believe that. And I also said that intent doesn't undo impact, and I think that's where we're stuck. They want forgiveness to work like an erasure, and I can't give them that. My sister called me last week, on a Sunday from her car. She was driving home from the gym. Everything the same, except also nothing the same. She said, have you thought any more about talking to them? I said, I think about it. She said, I'm not asking you to forgive them. I'm worried about you carrying this. I said, I'm okay. She said, you shouldn't have to be. Which is exactly what I said to Athisher years ago, and hearing it back in her voice, I felt something crack open a little in my chest. Not a bad crack. The kind that lets air in. I haven't decided anything yet. I don't know if I'll call them. I don't know if whatever we could rebuild would look enough like what we had to be worth. The work of building it. I know my parents are older now. And that time isn't unlimited. And I know that matters to me more than I sometimes let myself admit. But I also know my sister. I know what she looked like sitting at her kitchen table. Shaking but not crying. The morning she found those messages. I know what she sounded like on 100 Sunday calls when she was trying to tell me something without quite saying it. And I know that the family I lost. The version of my family where I was allowed to show up at my parents' house and not have to negotiate around the presence of the man who'd broken my sister's life. That version doesn't exist anymore. My parents made a choice. They made it slowly, incrementally, in 100 small moments they probably didn't even recognize as choices. And I think that's the thing I haven't been able to explain to them in a way they can hear. It wasn't one big betrayal. It was the steady accumulation of 1,000 small ones, each so minor it could be rationalized. Until the total weight of them became something I can't lift. I'm not the one who broke this family. I need to be clear about that. Because I've spent enough time wondering if I'm being too rigid, too unforgiving, too unwilling to let people be flawed and still loved. I've sat with that question honestly. And what I come back to every time is that my sister called me first. She drove to our parents' house, trusting that they would hold her. And they looked at her grief, and their first instinct was to protect someone else. That's not a flaw. That's a choice. And choices, as it turns out, have a weight that apologies don't always cancel out. The rosemary and garlic smell is still in my memory, the kitchen that looked so ordinary. The hockey game in the other room. My sister's hands flat on the table, very still. I keep thinking that if I could go back to that moment, not to change anything. Because I don't know what I would have done differently. But just to sit in it again. I would lean over to my sister and say, what I should have said more clearly, more often, for years. You were always going to be the one worth showing up for. I'm sorry it took this long for you to know that. I know that.